Welcome to the RevOps Lab, a podcast exploring the art and science of revenue operations. To find more episodes and resources on scaling your revenue engine, visit getweflow.com/RevOps. Hello and welcome to another edition of the RevOps Lab podcast. Our guest today is Stephanie Middaugh, and very glad to have her. Stephanie is a real operator. She worked her way up from the deal desk, senior sales operations specialist, various roles up to now being the head of Global GTM Enablement at a fast-growing B2B SaaS company. Stephanie, very warm welcome.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, great to have you. For our listeners, could you briefly introduce yourself in 2 or 3 sentences?
Yeah. So I'm Stephanie Middaugh. I have been doing enablement focus for the past 7 or 8 years now, but been doing operations and been in tech SaaS for the past 13, 14 years, I think, which seems a lot longer than it actually has been. And let's see, I'm based in Utah, but originally from Southern California. Grew up with a love of teaching. I wanted to be a teacher when I was growing up. So I think enablement is a pretty normal path for me. And yeah, what else can I say about myself? I have 2 cats. I live with my husband. I started playing the drums, which you'll see these in the background. I don't know, that's it. I'm kind of an open book, but that's me in a nutshell, I guess.
Okay, great. Yeah, love it. I also have 2 cats, so I can connect there. I think you mentioned a lot of interesting companies, WorkRamp, Divi, Zoom, DataStax, Sage. Currently you're at Pinecone, and I think it's just always interesting to understand sort of how you ended up where you currently are. So could you kind of go a bit deeper on your sort of professional journey?
Yeah, of course. So I started out in deal desk sales operations kind of arena way back early days at an ERP software organization at Sage Software. I was there for a good 6 years. Came across my first enablement role, which the title was actually sales productivity at the organization. It was my first startup company, and that was a wild ride, but super exciting. Alteryx went IPO, so I got to see them kind of in early stage startup all the way through kind of going public, which was so exciting. I got pulled back into sales operations in that company as they were kind of revamping or building up the sales ops function. I did that for a couple of years, and while I was good at it, it was one of those things that it just I just didn't love it. And I really missed doing enablement and training and supporting the sales team from that perspective. So I ended up moving over to DataStax. And that was ever since then, I've been kind of on the enablement path. I found myself at really small, scrappy startup organizations like Divi. Found myself at large organizations like Zoom. I was at Zoom in 2021, right after their just enormous, crazy ride in 2020 post-COVID pandemic. And then I've really throughout my experience, I've learned that I really enjoy being small enablement teams at a small scrappy startup, building from scratch and everything. So all of my experience has kind of led me to understanding where I personally thrive the best and the most impact that I feel I can have on organizations, which is at small companies. So I love it. It's not for everybody. Startup enablement is definitely not for everybody. But I am a sick person and I love it.
Yeah, I think what's the toughest thing about it? Do you think?
Startup enablement is very, very different, especially if you're a team of one. You're having to do kind of all of it, the strategy and the build and the execution and the reinforce, all of the things. Things change on a pretty regular basis. There can often be a little bit of a sense of whiplash in that you start down one path for one initiative, and then all of a sudden things just shift, whether it's the business, whether it's the market, whether it's a combination of all of the things. So being able to be nimble is challenging, especially when it comes to enablement, because it takes a lot of foresight into, how am I going to build this training, or how am I going to support this program or initiative or whatever. So that's the hardest thing about startup enablement is it's scrappy. You don't have a lot of resources. You don't have a lot of time to execute. Priorities change on a pretty frequent basis. It can be a lot, and it's definitely not for the faint of heart. That's for sure.
Yeah, it's a lot. Things are changing all the time, but that's kind of also the exciting thing. But if you have to rewrite the entire sort of like knowledge base and onboarding book for the third time, then for sure,
yes,
it takes a moment to
yes,
get
to say
started
the
again
least.
and find the
Yeah,
motivation.
just a moment. It's not a big deal.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, perfect. So yeah, I think in today's episode, we want to dive deeper into the relationship between sales enablement and revenue operations. I think it's like a fascinating topic personally. First of all, because I actually don't know that much about it. And so I'm curious to learn from you and with you. And the other thing is, I think there's so many things you can sort of like break or make with good sales enablement, particularly like at a startup where, you kind of like really get the first people on board. There's a lot of like hidden sort of like intangible knowledge often in the heads of the founders or like the first people that sort of like start there. And then you have these salespeople coming in, you have to onboard them and train them. And that can really break the entire company. I think so.
Yeah, it sure can. Or ideally, yes, ideally.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's just, it's a great topic to talk about. So Stephanie, in your own words, how would you describe sales enablement and what does it mean to you specifically?
Oh, such a heavy topic, and it's an interesting one because this is actually a point of discussion, contention, and in some ways, at some of the enablement conferences, is everybody has a little bit different of a definition of what it can and should be. I'll give you kind of like my definition. I also believe very strongly that you should define enablement for the company that you're at and you're supporting, because the enablement function at like Zoom at a large organization, for example, versus my enablement function at like Pinecone right now, worlds different, like vastly different as far as the approach that we were taking and what we were covering. For me though, like my brand or my view of enablement is all of the activities that support reps from BDRs through AEs to solutions engineers to customer success make the most of those interactions with their customers and with prospects at the end of the day. Of, do they understand the product? Do they understand the internal processes? Do they understand the value proposition? It's all of the things that go into supporting those teams to be effective, productive, efficient members of the go-to-market revenue organization as a whole. That can include training. It can include process documentation. It can include reaching across the aisle and creating consumable content or one pagers or whatever for the teams with product marketing. It can be working with revenue operations really closely to streamline processes and identify like gaps and areas for improvement. It's all of those little things that feed into kind of the larger enablement organization. It's actually my favorite interview question when I have been on the market looking for like roles and whatever, is to ask the leader that I'm speaking to, how do you view or how do you define enablement? Because that's going to tell me whether or not we're even on the same planet and whether we can be successful together.
Yeah. If you can bridge that gap, sort of like in whatever their definition is, or if it's just like too far apart.
Yes, it's not going to work.
Yeah. And curious, like, how does it work at Pinecone at the moment? Do you have revenue operations there at the moment as well? Do you cooperate, or what's the setup there?
Yeah, we do. So revenue operations was started before I joined. So I actually report up under revenue operations. My manager is Kyle Himmelwright, and he reports kind of under the umbrella of the CRO, which we're currently like actively looking for. So this is something that like operations came first, and then he hired on kind of the operational team, including myself in enablement.
Okay, that's great. I mean, that's very modern for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's also probably coming from Pinecone being a relatively young company, I think is fair to say. So then I think it's much more common that you actually have that RevOps function, and then you're currently looking for a CRO, as I understand it.
Yep. So
Yeah.
looking to kind of like bridge kind of all of those functions kind of together under that main umbrella, which is exciting. And this is I've reported under a few different types of structures in the past. Revenue operations is the most common. I've also reported directly under a CRO. I've reported under a VP of sales. My favorite structure is usually either operations or a CRO directly. But inevitably, operations and enablement, I usually tie really closely to them either way, whether I report directly under them or I don't.
Yeah. And how does that look like? So day to day, when you work with your peers in revenue operations, sort of like what is the working relationship there?
Yeah, right now, so my manager is obviously in kind of more of those executive level conversations. He has a lot more visibility into like what are the goals and priorities of the business of our leadership team, and then can bring those back down to us. So now I have more of that North Star to be like, okay, this is what the focus is for this quarter, this half, this year, whatever it is. These are the types of enablement initiatives that I can start kind of at least conceptualizing in my mind in order to support those ultimate goals. Typically, like when I didn't report under operations at other organizations, there was usually like a weekly or a bi-weekly sync just to make sure like what are the new things that are coming out? Are we rolling out a new process? Is there new tools? Is there something kind of going on in the business that I need to be aware of? If I need help with like reporting or analytics or stuff like that, pulling data, usually they're the first team that I'm gonna go to kind of leverage that information from. So really close partnership from that perspective, usually on a biweekly or weekly kind of cadence, depending on the organization.
Yeah, yeah. And are you embedded within? So it doesn't sound like, are you embedded in the RevOps team, or is it more like on the side of the RevOps team, or like how does it work?
I would say embedded is probably the best description for it, like right now. So it's myself and then two other of my peers that report directly up to my manager, systems and tools and kind of like true like operational processes and things like that, and then enablement. So I would say like embedded is probably the best term for it right now.
Yeah, yeah. And then what are some other typical stakeholders? So you mentioned updates to the product. So do you talk directly to product management, or like how does that flow of information work?
Yeah. Usually it's coming from product marketing directly. So I have a really close partnership with product marketing. That's pretty common across the organizations that I've been at as well. So staying up to date with kind of what's going on with that. Their product marketing is usually a really great kind of translator or in between like product and like the go-to-market function, which is great. Other stakeholders are like business development or like partnerships for any of the external kind of like ISV or channel partners or however kind of the organization is structured. Marketing as a whole, as inclusive of product marketing is another organization. Sales, customer success, field engineering. We've got like here at Pinecone currently. So I've got weekly reoccurring or biweekly reoccurring meetings with all of the stakeholders kind of across the business just to stay up to date with like, what are you working on? What's going on? Or what are you hearing from the field? What do they need help with? Where are they struggling? What are you noticing? Those kinds of things. So even if there isn't any direct like action items or requests, just having that like ear to the ground basically of like what's going on can help me stay on top of or prepare for things that might be coming down the pipeline.
Got it. Okay. Great. Yeah. So I think maybe one thing interesting also to understand is you mentioned the term North Star earlier.
Yeah.
But sort of like, what is it that what you're thinking about, like when you have all these conversations, sort of like, what is your inner goal? So you talk to I don't know, solution engineering, you talk to field sales. Like, what are you thinking about? Like, what is your goal in the company?
Ultimately, my goal is to make remove roadblocks from my reps and my leaders as much as humanly possible. Sometimes it might seem like I am adding roadblocks because I'm asking too many questions or trying to like answer things that maybe haven't been solved for yet. But at the end of the day, that's what I want. I want my team to feel supported. I want them to have all of the information that they need in order to feel productive. I love being around kind of like salespeople in general. Like I've never been a seller before, but I love the energy and just the overall vibe that you get from kind of like sales in particular, but like go to market in general. So understanding like, what can I do to support you? I'm not carrying that weight of a quota, but I can definitely like carry the weight of, okay, you are running into an issue here, you don't have enough knowledge here, or we need more information, or like whatever it is. Let me be the one to kind of advocate for them internally and find the resources or information that they need in order to make them efficient and productive.
Yeah, got it. Okay. Great. I mean, Pinecone itself, maybe I think it would be worth spending like 1 minute explaining what Pinecone does.
Sure.
But maybe you want to do that first. Yeah.
Of course. So Pinecone is a purpose-built vector database, which if you're anything like me, when I first started, I was like right over the top of my head. I was like, I have no idea what that is. So essentially what it is at the end of the day, and all of my new hires that have gone through my class are going to be grading my elevator pitch on this one now at this point. But essentially what it is it's the database layer for most generative AI applications that are being built today. So it makes it so that you can access the information that you've uploaded into kind of the system at a much faster and more reliable kind of speed. So you would partner with your LLM or your large language model in order to kind of like grab that data. Some of our customers are like Gong as an example. Notion is a customer of ours. So companies that are really kind of like have all of this access to this great information, they need to be able to kind of ping it really quickly. That purpose-built kind of vector database layer makes it possible for those companies to be able to do it at that fast speed that their customers are asking for. So boiled way down, like it's a very technical kind of space and product. But that's kind of the nitty-gritty high-level overview of kind of what it is.
No, I love it. I think like infrastructure for modern AI in companies like Gong, and so that's great. I think that's that is a great business to operate in. And so, I mean, as sort of like a very technical product, I assume that's also not super easy to explain.
Yep.
And you already mentioned, so you don't only have AEs, you have the sales engineers, you have customer success. I'm sure there's like customer support as well, and all these other go-to-market functions. So how do you make sure that the people who join Pinecone as new starters actually really understand what Pinecone does and how they should talk about it, how they should sell it, how they should support the customers?
Yeah. Onboarding is my favorite thing about enablement overall. It's a big passion project, I would say, of mine, or a big passion like pillar for enablement overall. When I joined Pinecone, it was typical kind of like startup organization. You had like a Word doc that was just like, read these articles, like watch these Gong calls, and then like, congratulations, there you go. So I built the onboarding kind of structure from scratch. We actually host in-person kind of like onboarding boot camps for our new hires at our HQ in New York, which I'm very grateful that we're able to do it in person, because there's an element that we definitely kind of missed out on during kind of the COVID pandemic, when everything was virtual, and you just kind of miss that, human to human contact. But ultimately, like usually what I do is I sit down and I map out what do each of these new hires need to know in the first 30, 60, 90 days of their tenure at the company, and then work backwards from there, right? Usually it falls into a couple of different buckets. It's the market landscape that the company is kind of in, like what's the company history? Who are some of the players in the space? What does that look like? What are those conversations going to be? For Pinecone, especially, one of the things that I've been focusing really heavily on is where do we fit in that generative AI kind of tech stack? That way they can visualize when our prospects or customers are working with us, who are all the other people that they're going to have to work with as well, and how can we make our experience as seamless and easy as possible for them, not just from obviously a product perspective, but from a sales perspective as well. And then from there, like, what are the processes they need to be aware of? What are our sales stages? What does our customer journey look like? What are some of the, kind of nuances of our business and where we play that they need to be aware of? How do they engage with partners? Like all of these little things. And then coming back in and organizing all of that into kind of a streamlined flow. It's funny, I'm actually in the midst of preparing for our next onboarding class, which is taking place in May. And this is the fifth class that we're hosting, which is pretty exciting. And every single time I've run this before, like I gather feedback from the new hires, what worked, what didn't work, what did you like, where are the gaps? And each and every time it's been iterated on and it's been kind of expanded on. Usually I've been starting like the boot camp is like pretty high level in that it's able to cover like our account executives and our solutions engineers, like just at that like 30,000 foot level. This next one, I'm excited. I'm actually taking it the next level, or the next iteration is going to be, let's start diving into very role specific information. Like, how are you forecasting? What does, the internal Salesforce process opportunity flow look like for our technical people? Like, let's dive deep into the technical aspects of things. How do you run a demo? What does that entail? What does that look like? What are some of the resources that they can have access to? So for me, it's always starting about like laying a really solid ground foundation and then building up from there and figuring out what's working, what's not, and consistently kind of iterating on that based on needs of the business, needs of the people that we're hiring too. And then, what levers do we need to pull to make people more productive?
Yeah. Okay. Wow. I can definitely see your passion, and then like, there was a lot, but I absolutely love it. I mean, you definitely can see the passion from teaching coming to play here. So it definitely sounds like a teacher always trying to improve year over year the class and the curriculum, and just making it really easier to digest and the students more successful. A few things just want to hone in on. So like, I really like this 30, 60, 90 concept a lot. I think this is also like a really good thing to do just generally as a manager. Right? Like you hire somebody and then you kind of like want to discuss, hey, after 30 days, I like my expectations. After 60 days, these are my expectations. 90 days, you should be able to do that. Give people some guidance, give people some framework, what is sort of like expected from them organizationally. So just curious, like, is this something that is like more broadly defined together with leadership, or is this something that you do on the side separately? How is that tied together?
Yeah, it's kind of a combination of both, actually. So I definitely obviously have my own kind of opinions, best practices, things that I've seen work really well. I actually had a meeting with our leadership team, like our sales leaders, our head of field engineering, and a couple of the other leadership were kind of in attendance, but we had an entire kind of like couple of days workshop where we sat down and we're like, okay, what does success look like for your specific team, for enterprise sales, for commercial sales, for like EMEA sales, that kind of stuff. How do we define success? What does good look like? Do we see it being exhibited right now in our reps? If we do, what are the specific skills and behaviors that they are doing that we should and can replicate throughout the entire kind of team? So it's a combination of making sure that I bring my own ideas to the table and best practices, but then also being flexible enough to mold whatever the business needs or whatever. And it could just be for this year or for this like 6-month stretch. This is what the business needs. Okay, great. Like, how can I be flexible enough to support that while still building for kind of scale in the future? And I think this is where kind of that it's applicable to everybody information like at boot camp kind of comes into play. And then I'm going to start like really narrowing it down. If I started with the narrow piece first, I'm going to be spinning my wheels and working really hard. I'm all about the work smarter, not harder kind of scenario. So making sure that I can like start broad and then like scope down as needed based on the roles that are coming into play.
Okay. Yeah, that's really great. I think, so what are some of the most common mistakes that you're seeing when running, or like that you've encountered yourself when doing onboardings? One thing you mentioned in the beginning was also differentiation, like how you talk about like sort of like Pinecone, how it fits into the Gen AI stack. I think that was like a really important one. I think like a lot of companies are not really good at explaining what makes them different to like their 10,000 competitors. So I'm assuming this is one, but curious, like what else you think are pretty common mistakes?
Yeah. Mistakes are an interesting one because like you won't know it until you like step right in it. It's like a pile of poop. You're just like, oh, there it is. Like it's right there, and I just stepped right in it. It's one of those things where I've definitely started. I've started too specific. I've started like too narrow, and then I have to like, oh, that was like we need to like pop it out a little bit, or it's not as applicable to whomever. One of the things too that I think often gets missed, and I know I've missed it in a lot of my previous kind of roles. The further in that I've gotten into kind of like enablement, I've actually been on like the buyer side. So I can relate to all of the different things that, you know, buyers kind of go through of like, I don't want to sit through another discovery. And like when you're evaluating a bunch of vendors, for me, like I actually started bringing that into my onboarding experience of instead of like a checklist of you have to make sure that you ask these questions on BANT, like you have to fill out your BANT checklist spreadsheet or whatever to make sure that the opportunity is qualified. Instead, it's all about kind of like giving a crap about the prospect themselves. Like, what are they struggling with? What are they trying to solve for? If they had a magic wand, what would this kind of solution look like? Why are they even talking to me right now? Who else are they talking to? Like, understanding like the buyer on a very like human kind of level, I think will, for me at least, like this is where I've started kind of like changing my approach, especially in onboarding. I tell my new hires all the time, just like lean into genuine curiosity. Like I'm going to give you a list of discovery questions. I'm going to give you a list of qualifiers that we need you to kind of like fill out for whatever framework methodology we want. But at the end of the day, like as a buyer, I'm going to know when you're checking off your list versus like actually wanting to engage with me on a human personal kind of level. There's an art to it, but you can do the two things at the exact same time. Right. So I would say like, that's one thing that I've definitely seen mistakes, and I've made those mistakes myself, is making sure that the team that you're training isn't just seeming like a robot, that they actually are selling on a humanistic kind of level. Even if you're transactional sales, you can still develop like a relationship with the customers that you're working with. So I think that's an important thing. I think for me is like methodology, process, whatever, all of those, that rigor is important, but make sure that the team that you're supporting at the end of the day doesn't come out sounding and interacting with your customers like robots.
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, that's terrible. And I totally can relate to your point of like the checklist part. Definitely been there as a buyer.
Oh, yes.
Right. Yeah. And probably also as a seller, if I'm honest. Like,
yep. It's easy to fall into. It's 100% easy to fall into.
Yeah. And sometimes you are in these conversations where you're like, I just don't know how to make that transition now. So I'm just going to ask like really bluntly and stupidly and like, hopefully it will be okay. One thing I'm curious in that regard is, so, you know, sometimes you have these like really, really good sellers and they're just like, they bring in all the quota, they bring in all the deals. How do you deal with these people? Like, are they less engaged in an onboarding, or are they super engaged in onboarding, or just like the others? And it's just, you know, you find out later that they're like actually like really, really like top 1% sellers, president club, sort of like style.
It very much depends on the person. I would say like I've met those really experienced kind of mature sellers who have been I've been doing this for 20 years, you know, like longer than you've been alive kind of a situation. Sometimes those folks, like I've had those conversations with other enablement professionals where they're like, I've got these like really tenured sellers and they don't give a crap about enablement or like whatever. And sometimes the best response is like, fine, like then I'm not going to waste my breath, my time on trying to convince you that you need to do the things that I think that you should do. So that's like one approach, is like sometimes you just have to like cut them off and just be like, have at it, like just go live your best life, and I'm not going to worry about you. But there are other sellers that actually, they want to, like if you run into those really tenured experience, like A-player sellers that aren't maybe as necessarily engaged with your training content, but they like to give back. They like to like, kind of pay it forward to the team. Leverage those people all day, every day. Like, I don't need to be the one that's always talking to the team. I don't need to be the one that's always training the team. If I've got an internal subject matter expert, if I've got a rep that is crushing quota, doing the things that we want them to do is also an important thing. They're not like a maverick kind of rogue agent that are doing weird things that we don't want them to do, but they're doing all of the right things. They're hitting their quota. Like, let me highlight them. Let me put them in front of their peers, because their peers are going to want to hear from the person that's going to President's Club every year and crushing quota and like blowing it out of the water. Like, let me shine a big old spotlight on them and engage with their peers and make sure that they understand, like, this is what we should be doing. Like, this person can do it. You can do it too. Here's like breaking down all of the things. For me though, from like an enablement perspective, a lot of times if you go to those really great sellers and you're like, what are you doing? How are you doing this? And they're like, I don't know, I'm just doing it. And like, it just comes naturally to them. So for me, that's like on me, or from like an enablement standpoint, it's up to enablement to be like, okay, I'm going to shadow you. I'm going to observe what you're doing, and I'm going to figure out what makes you so awesome at your job, and kind of like pull that out of them, because sometimes they genuinely don't know. So all day, every day, I would like put those folks in front of their peers if they're able and willing, and if they're doing the right things. Sometimes you have to like just let the other rogue agents go off on their own and be like, okay, fine. And then you'll have the other ones that are like sponges that just want to like absorb all of the stuff. And those are always really, really fun too.
Yeah. And how do you go about, I think there's like, product company specific sales enablement, and then there's more like this, hey, these are like the fundamentals, these are the things that you absolutely need to know, like medic, right?
Sure.
For example, or a band, or things like this, or sales stages. I would assume, I mean, of course they can be specific to the sort of like process that you're the style that you're selling, but overall it feels more like, okay, this is like some fundamental sales knowledge I'm going to teach you now. Sort of like, what is sort of like the ratio there? Or maybe you completely disagree with what I just said, which is also fine. So,
I would say it's probably like at least initially, it's a 50-50 kind of split, as far as like, you should run like really good discovery, right? You should be able to handle objections pretty well. You should figure out how to negotiate. You should be able to have that kind of executive presence or conversation. Like, these are all, I would say, like those table stakes kind of sales skills at the end of the day. And then you layer on kind of the nuances of your business, the personas, like all of those things. Understanding, the big one actually is also understanding how to leverage the technology. So like, Salesforce instances are always going to be a little bit different. Sales stages are always going to be a little bit different. But like, as a rep that like, okay, this is how I can leverage Salesforce, or this is how I can manage my day. The tech stack in general, LinkedIn Sales Navigator, like Outreach, Sales Loft, like the outbounding tools. Can I use Gong to, kind of play back my calls or whatever? I think those are important pieces that are also kind of table stakes information. So at least initially, I always look at it as kind of a 50-50 split of, here are the sales skills that I know every seller is going to need. And then here's kind of the layer on top of, or the nuance that's particular to our business that the reps are going to need to kind of be aware of or familiar with, or whatever. So I think there's that good kind of cutoff. And then as you continue to mature your enablement organization or department, you can start pulling those levers and be like, actually, we need more like tailored skills to our industry or whatever it is, instead of kind of the whatever it is, the sales cycles that I've been a part of. Like, when I was at WorkRamp, the sales stages, the people we were dealing with, like that, wildly different from like the sales process here at Pinecone. The fundamentals are still kind of the same, but like that layered nuance on top of it makes a world of difference. So I think that's where you can start pulling those levers to really understand, okay, this is where we need to go deeper, or discovery matters a hell of a lot more in this kind of sale versus another one, or whatever that is.
Yeah. Okay. Great. You mentioned technology there. So I think this is a good point maybe to transition to some other topics that I think are that I'm definitely interested in, because I have some ideas, but just curious. So what kind of like role does technology play in sales enablement? What kind of like tools do you like to have in your stack, or what kind of like tools, if you had a magic wand and could just buy whatever you want, what would you buy?
Yeah. My first thing, I've ever since I like stood up my first like enablement function, the very first tool that I always go for is always a learning management system, because I find that it makes my life a lot easier, especially when it comes from like an onboarding perspective, duplicating kind of all of that work. Recordings are okay, but I would say being able to like wrap some legitimate kind of adult learning theory training, like legitimate training kind of around it, assessments, all of those things. For me, it just like makes my life a hell of a lot easier. So that's usually like the first system that I come in and I get. I did it when I was at Divvy. I did it when I joined here at Pinecone. I was like, we need an LMS like right off the bat. Like that's what we got to get. Content management systems can be hugely effective, but I found that like when I was at Divvy, now like here at Pinecone, we're too small. Like we're not mature enough for like a true CMS solution, because we just like don't have enough content. And I've seen the solutions on the market. I've experienced them before. There's some really phenomenal tools out there, but you have like your company has to be ready for it. Like you have to have enough, like there needs to be enough content for it to be genuinely valuable. So I would say like LMS first, content management system is like a fast-ish follow depending on the maturity and size of your organization. For me, those are like the top two tools. And then obviously like coaching, like a Gong or something like that can really come into play, especially if you've got a heavy coaching culture in your organization. That can be amazing. One thing that I've actually run into that I haven't mentioned yet. So I was doing consulting in between kind of a layoff period that I had last year. And I do have some enablement coaching clients that I still work with right now. And one of the things that I've run into is actually that like sometimes, like even with all of the, privacy laws and whatever, sometimes the organization or the team or the industry doesn't want their calls recorded. So this runs into like a very interesting kind of thing, is a lot of us are relying on a call recording software like a Gong to provide coaching, but sometimes some of these very delicate industries, I would say, or cautious industries are not allowing those calls. So like, what do you do? Like, how do you coach? How do you make sure that your reps are holding to the messaging or processes that you need them to? So it's an interesting kind of conundrum in that I feel like we swung in one direction of like, oh, well, you got to have a Gong or something like that. But like, there are some industries where you can't have that. And in that case, like, okay, what do? You kind of have to go back to the drawing board. So it's an interesting thing of how things just kind of mature and move about too.
Yeah. Weflow is based in Europe and definitely does play a role here. Yeah, you see it a lot less regularly in calls. People are surprised if the call is recorded and so on, which I can understand.
Sure.
So it's just like not really part of the culture. And then like we are also based in Germany, so here it's even worse.
GDPR laws there
From a GDPR
perspective, super intense.
Exactly. So you have to be really careful. Also, as a selling company, really. Curious with these learning management systems. Is that also a way for you to sort of like measure your progress, your success, by exactly knowing, okay, this is how many people started the course, or like these are the, I don't know if you do that, like badges or stars that people collected, and and the certificates that they got, or so just generally, like how do you think about measuring your work and the impact it has on the people that you teach, and how do you bring that back to the organization? that's a pretty big question, but yeah.
It is the hottest topic in enablement is enablement KPIs, and how do you measure your impact, and how do you prove value, and how do you become a strategic member of the organization and the leadership team and everything. And I'll caveat all of this with saying, like, I've got my opinions and kind of the flow that I follow, but I will caveat everything with saying that, like, sometimes you can do all of the right things, and I've mentioned this on a number of podcasts that I've been on, and now that I went through like a layoff last year, I've seen it kind of firsthand of you can do all the right things. You can prove the value. You can point to, I made an impact here. I made a difference. And sometimes it just like still isn't enough. And that's like a really sucky feeling. It's a really sucky experience. But I like to kind of like lay that out there of like, well, Stephanie said, like, if I do all these things, then, you know, I can yes, 100%.
Yeah.
But like, there's still market shifts and all of the things that go into it. So, I tend to think about enablement KPIs and like metrics in 3 different buckets usually. So there's what I would call like the metrics that are like we're accountable to. These are things that we can legitimately point to and say we had an effect on this. Ideally, these fall into like the onboarding bucket really nicely. So time to first deal, time to second deal. Ideally, if we're doing our jobs appropriately or well enough, we should see a decrease in the time to first deal, because now the reps are going to understand how to run a sales process better. They understand what questions to ask. They're qualifying better opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. So we should see a decline in time to first deal, time to second deal, that kind of thing. So that's something that we can point to and say, yes, enablement had a direct impact on that. And then any initiative that you put forth should be tied to some kind of metric. So one of my past organizations, we were moving into, or we were targeting a new persona, like a whole new persona. So like my entire initiative was like, great, we're going to go after this persona. The metrics that I was tracking all the way from like BDRs, are they setting more meetings with this new persona? Like what was before the training and then after the training? And then conversion to opportunities. Are we seeing a higher rate of lead to opportunity conversion? And then from conversion to close, are we seeing ideally a higher percentage of deals closing within this new persona? Are we seeing a higher percentage of upsells into expanding into this new persona with existing customer base? So like those types of metrics, 100%. Could I point to it and be like, yeah, I got 100% completion rate on the training that I rolled out? Sure. But I'm going to say like a spicy opinion, like that's a lazy metric. Like it's not enough for you to be like, ta-da, like I did the thing. You need to tie it to some kind of outcome that's going to resonate with the executive leadership. And then, so like accountable metrics, those are like things that we can point to and be like, I did that. I would say like finger on the pulse metrics, or like trackable metrics, or things that I've seen people try to tie to, but like we really can't tie to certain things. Like, did a rep hit their quota? Yes, sure. Was it because of me and the things that I did? That's a stretch. Like I've seen enablement professionals do that before, and it could have been they had like great spiffs in place that year. They had great kind of commission plans in place that year. The market was just on fire. Like those are things that like should be tracked, but we can't point to them and say like, correlation does not equal causation kind of a thing. And then the third bucket that I always look at is what I like, the sentiment kind of KPIs, which is what are people saying? Like genuinely, like this was helpful, this was sucky, like I loved this, I hated this, enablement's the worst, enablement's the best. What is the sentiment on the floor? And like what's the feedback that you're getting anecdotally? Wrapping all of those together in a really nice kind of served up package to your leadership team, inevitably, hopefully, is going to give you like a really good rounded story to tell.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's not to don't want to go too deep into it, but I think it's a great point. Sort of like there are these metrics that help you do your job better, but it doesn't really make sense to share them. Like if the completion rate is like super low, for example, right? Then okay, that's good for you to know, but it doesn't really have like the greater impact of your organization. Like like the CRO is not going to care so much about that. I want you to fix that.
People
obviously
attend my training. Yeah, whoop-de-doo.
Exactly. congratulations.
Yeah, exactly.
But then really like paying into the overall sort of like North Star metrics that the organization has at the moment. If that is like upselling at the moment, right, then how do you pay into that
Yes.
bucket, and what's your impact there? So I think that's a really good perspective. Okay, Stephanie, this has been great. I learned so much. Just to close things off, we ask everybody the same question. So looking back at your career, what kind of advice would you give yourself if you were just starting out now, or to someone who was like, just starting out?
Yeah. I always tell people, and whenever I have not done this, I've always regretted it, but it's like always trust your gut and like listen to like what the vibes are telling you, what your gut is telling you, like trust your gut. Whenever I have gone into roles or positions or made a choice that I was like, I don't know if I agree, like whenever I've questioned it or gone against kind of my better instinct, I've always regretted it in some way, shape, or form. Like there's always a learning there somewhere. But there's usually like an opportunity for me to be like, oh, that's what that red flag was. That was kind of like in the back of my mind. And I should have kind of paid attention to it. So I would say like, that's probably the advice that I would give like my younger self, is just like always like trust your gut and listen to that kind of inner voice a little bit more. Cause there's usually something or some reason for it to be screaming at you. So that's the piece of advice, I think, for sure.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And,
you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the RevOps Lab podcast. Please consider to like and subscribe our show and give us a 5-star rating on wherever you're listening. If you have feedback or suggestions, let us know at podcast@getweflow.com. We read and reply to every email. Thank you.